Welcome to the quiet world of dreams.
Tonight, imagine yourself standing in Strasbourg on a warm summer evening in the year 1518. The city is still awake. The streets are narrow, the buildings close together, their upper floors leaning slightly over the roads below. Wooden beams frame the walls. Small windows are beginning to darken as the light fades, and somewhere nearby, a cart moves slowly across uneven stone. There is no music playing. No festival has been announced. Nothing unusual seems to be happening. And yet, somewhere in the city, a woman has begun to dance. Not because she is celebrating, not because anyone has asked her to. She simply moves, and she does not seem able to stop. For a while, people watch. Perhaps they assume she is ill. Perhaps they think she is behaving strangely. Perhaps they simply continue on their way. But the dancing does not end that evening. It continues into the following days, and gradually, other people begin to move with her. What follows will become one of the strangest episodes recorded in European history. For several weeks during the summer of 1518, people in Strasbourg experienced what historians now call a dancing mania or choreomania. The exact number of people involved is uncertain. Some historical accounts suggest dozens. Later estimates have placed the number much higher, perhaps several hundred. Even the details of the deaths traditionally associated with the episode are less certain than the popular story suggests. What we do know is that something unusual happened. People danced. They continued for extraordinarily long periods, and the authorities of Strasbourg struggled to understand what they were seeing. So tonight, you do not need to imagine monsters in the darkness. There is no hidden creature waiting behind a doorway. There is no need for a supernatural explanation. Instead, we are going to enter a city where people were already living with hunger, disease, religious fear, social tension, and an uncertain future. And then we will ask a very simple question. What happens to the human mind when an entire community begins to believe that something impossible is happening? Let the streets become quieter for a moment. The year is 1518. Strasbourg is part of the Holy Roman Empire in the region of Alsace. Today, the city is in France. But 5 centuries ago, it was a busy and important European city with its own political institutions, religious life, markets, craftsmen, merchants, and crowded streets. Life was not easy. For ordinary people, food security could be uncertain. Disease was a constant presence. Religious belief shaped almost every part of daily existence, from the beginning of life to its end. People did not have modern ideas about infection, psychology, neurological disorders, or mass behavior. When something strange happened to the body, explanations were drawn from the knowledge available at the time. Illness could be understood through humors. Misfortune could be interpreted through religion. An unusual behavior could be connected to sin, punishment, possession, curses, or divine intervention. This does not mean that people of the 16th century were irrational. They were working with the medical and cultural framework available to them. And that framework matters when we try to understand what happened in Strasbourg, because the dancing did not occur in an empty world. It happened in a community already under pressure. The years around 1518 had brought hardship to the region. Historical research points to famine and food shortages, disease, unusual weather, and social tension surrounding the population. The summer itself was unusually hot. For people living close to the limits of survival, heat was not simply uncomfortable. It could make work harder. It could affect food. It could add another layer of exhaustion to an already difficult life. And beneath all of this was something harder to measure. Fear. Fear of illness. Fear of hunger. Fear of punishment. Fear of divine judgment. Fear of forces that ordinary people could not see and did not know how to control. In such an environment, the human mind did not need to be weak for strange things to happen. It only needed to be human. The first dancer is traditionally identified as a woman called Frau Trophäa. But even here, we should slow down. Her name appears in later accounts, and the surviving historical material does not allow us to reconstruct her life with certainty. We do not know what she looked like. We do not know exactly where she lived. We do not know what she was thinking when she stepped into the street. And we certainly cannot know what she would have said if someone had asked her why she was dancing. Those details belong to imagination, not history. What the surviving accounts allow us to say is much simpler. In July 1518, a woman in Strasbourg began dancing uncontrollably. According to accounts written later, she continued for days. Her behavior attracted attention, and other people began to join. At first, the number was small. Then it grew. Within a short time, the phenomenon had become a public problem. Imagine the streets now. People gathering around the dancers, some watching from doorways, others whispering, a few perhaps laughing nervously because they do not know what else to do. The dancers themselves are moving through the heat. There is no stage, no audience that has purchased tickets, no celebration, just bodies moving again and again. The most disturbing part may not have been the movement itself. It was the apparent inability to stop. For the people watching, this was not ordinary dancing. It was something that seemed to happen to a person, something that took control. And once several people were experiencing it, the question changed. It was no longer, what is wrong with that person? It became, what is happening to us? Strasbourg's authorities did not immediately understand the phenomenon, and the response they eventually chose seems strange to modern eyes. Some physicians reportedly believed that the dancers were suffering from what was described at the time as an excess or overheating of blood. The logic belonged to the medical thinking of the period. If the body had become overheated, perhaps physical activity would somehow help restore balance. The authorities therefore did not simply order everyone to remain still. Instead, they permitted or encouraged dancing in designated places. Musicians were brought in, spaces were provided. The intention, according to historical accounts, was to allow the afflicted to dance through the condition. Today, the idea sounds almost absurd. A person cannot stop dancing, so the solution is to provide music. But viewed through 16th century medical beliefs, the decision becomes less mysterious. The authorities were trying to treat what they believed was a physical disorder. They were not trying to create a spectacle. They were attempting to solve a problem with the knowledge they possessed. And yet, the situation continued. The number of dancers increased. The summer heat remained. The physical strain became severe. People became exhausted. Some reportedly collapsed, There are later accounts of deaths connected to the episode, but this is one of the places where the famous story becomes more uncertain. Modern retellings often claim that people danced themselves to death in large numbers, sometimes repeating a figure of 15 deaths a day. That detail is frequently presented as fact, but the surviving evidence does not allow us to state it with confidence. The earliest records do not provide a reliable death count of that kind. Later accounts may have amplified the story, so it is safer to say that the dancing was physically dangerous, that people collapsed, and that deaths have been associated with the episode in later historical descriptions. The exact number remains unknown. History sometimes becomes more interesting when we admit that we do not know. By now, the city must have felt different. The ordinary rhythm of life had been interrupted. A street was no longer simply a street. It had become a place where people gathered to watch bodies moving against their will. A public square could become a place of fear. A familiar face could suddenly behave in a way nobody understood, and every new dancer changed the meaning of the event. If one person behaved strangely, perhaps it was an illness. If 10 people behaved strangely, perhaps it was an epidemic. If dozens did the same thing, people naturally searched for a common cause. Something must be spreading. Something must be passing from one person to another. But what? There was no virus anyone could see, no obvious poison, no wound, no visible infection. And this is where the story begins to move away from the streets and toward the human mind. One of the most famous explanations for the dancing plague is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on grains, particularly rye, under certain conditions. Some compounds produced by ergot can affect the nervous system. The idea is therefore easy to understand. If people ate contaminated grain, perhaps the fungus caused hallucinations, spasms, agitation, or unusual behavior. It sounds convincing at first, and for decades it became one of the most popular explanations for the dancing plague. But there is a problem. The symptoms associated with ergot poisoning do not fit the Strasbourg event neatly. Ergotism can produce severe neurological and physical effects, but historians and medical researchers have pointed out that it does not easily explain a large group of people apparently displaying the same prolonged dancing behavior. There is also a geographic problem with using ergot as a universal explanation for the broader history of dancing manias. And perhaps most importantly, the historical descriptions do not provide the kind of medical evidence we would want if we were diagnosing poisoning today. There are no preserved blood samples, no laboratory tests, no grain samples from the exact households involved, no modern clinical examinations. So ergot remains a hypothesis, but not a solved answer. It is a possibility that helps us think about the event. It is not a fact that closes the case. There is another possibility, and it is much harder to visualize because it does not require a mysterious substance. It requires people. It requires fear. It requires expectation. And it requires a community in which certain ideas are already powerful. The modern term often used in discussions of Strasbourg is mass psychogenic illness. The basic idea is that psychological and social forces can produce real physical symptoms in groups of people. The symptoms are not imaginary. The suffering is not fake. The body is genuinely affected. We know today that stress can influence movement, breathing, heart rate, pain, fainting, and many other physical processes. Under certain circumstances, symptoms can spread socially. One person becomes ill. Others observe the symptoms. They become frightened. Their attention becomes focused on the same threat. And the behavior of one person can influence another. This does not mean that everyone simply copies everyone else consciously. The process can be much more complicated. Expectation changes perception. Fear changes attention. Attention changes bodily sensations. And bodily sensations can reinforce fear. The cycle can become self-sustaining. In Strasbourg, there was an additional ingredient, the cultural belief that dancing itself could become a kind of supernatural affliction. Across parts of Europe, stories existed about dancing manias. Saint Vitus was associated with dancing curses in European religious culture. People believed that certain saints could punish or cure those affected by strange dancing disorders. This mattered because people interpret unfamiliar experiences through the ideas they already possess. If you live in a world where a dancing curse is culturally imaginable, seeing someone suddenly dance uncontrollably does not produce the same interpretation it would in a modern hospital. The first thought may not be neurological disease. It may be spiritual danger. And once that belief enters a crowd, the boundary between expectation and experience can become difficult to see. Imagine the woman again. She is standing in the street. Her body moves. Someone watches. Another person watches. A few people begin to believe that something has happened to her. Then perhaps another person feels strange. A tremor, a sensation in the legs, an impulse to move. Under ordinary circumstances, the sensation might pass, but now everyone is watching. Everyone is talking. Everyone is waiting to see who will be next. The body becomes the center of attention, and the fear grows. This is not a supernatural explanation. It is a psychological one. And psychological explanations do not make an event less real. If someone experiences uncontrollable movement because of a powerful interaction between stress, expectation, culture, and the nervous system, that person is still suffering. The movement is still real. The exhaustion is still real. The fear is still real. The distinction is important. Because for centuries, unusual behavior has often been dismissed as pretending. But modern medicine has shown us that the mind and body cannot be separated as neatly as we once imagined. There is something almost quiet about the ending. We often tell stories about mysteries as though they must finish with an answer, a final revelation, a hidden truth, a single sentence that makes everything clear. But Strasbourg does not give us that ending. The dancing stopped. We know that. The city moved on. We know that too. But why the phenomenon began, why it spread, and why it ended when it did remain uncertain. Perhaps several causes came together. A body under stress, a mind shaped by expectation, a community under pressure, a religious culture that already possessed a language for unexplained dancing, a summer of heat, a history of hardship. None of these needs to exclude the others. History rarely behaves like a laboratory experiment. Human beings are complicated systems. Sometimes the most honest explanation is not a single cause, but an interaction between many smaller ones. And perhaps this is why the dancing plague of 1518 has survived for so long, not because it is simply strange, but because it forces us to look at something uncomfortable. The human body is not always under conscious control. The mind is not isolated from the people around it. Fear can move through a community. Belief can influence sensation. Expectation can shape experience. And under extreme circumstances, the boundary between individual suffering and collective behavior can become surprisingly thin. We like to imagine that we understand ourselves. Most of the time, we probably do well enough. We know when we are tired. We know when we are frightened. We know when we are hungry. We know when we are moving because we have chosen to move. But there are moments when the nervous system becomes more complicated than conscious intention. A hand trembles, a breath changes, a heart begins to race, a person faints, a crowd becomes afraid, and suddenly the body is doing something the mind did not consciously request. For the people of Strasbourg, that mystery played out in the streets, in the heat of the summer, among wooden houses and stone roads, under the eyes of neighbors who could not look away. Tonight, when we imagine those streets again, perhaps it is better not to picture hundreds of people dancing wildly beneath a dramatic sky. The historical evidence does not give us such a perfect scene. Instead, imagine something quieter. A city at the end of a difficult summer, the light fading from the buildings, a few people walking home, the sound of footsteps against stone, a distant church bell, and somewhere, a person standing still after weeks of movement. Perhaps for the first time in a long while, her body is quiet. There is no explanation waiting. No physician has solved the mystery. No historian has found a complete answer, only silence. The dancing plague of 1518 eventually became another strange entry in the long history of human experience. But perhaps it should not be remembered only as a story about people who danced. It is also a story about how people make sense of suffering, about how communities respond when ordinary explanations fail, about how fear can become physical, and about how difficult it can be, even centuries later, to separate what happened from the stories people told about what happened. We know that something happened in Strasbourg. We know that people experienced prolonged, unusual movement. We know that authorities attempted several responses. We know that religious beliefs shaped the way the event was interpreted. And we know that the episode eventually ended. Beyond that, the ground becomes softer. There are theories. There are possibilities. There are interpretations, but there is no final answer. And perhaps that is where this story should remain. Not solved, but understood a little better. The streets are quiet now. The summer of 1518 is far away. The people who watch the dancers are long gone. The dancers themselves are gone. Their houses have changed. Their city has changed. The language they spoke has changed. Even the names of the streets have been altered by centuries of history. But somewhere beneath all of those changes is the same human question. What happens when we experience something we cannot explain? Do we search for a supernatural cause? Do we search for a medical one? Do we look to the people around us? Do we look inward? Perhaps we do all of these things at once. And perhaps that is what makes the story of Strasbourg so difficult to close. Because the mystery is not only about what happened to them, it is also about what we might do if we were standing in that same street, watching, listening, trying to understand. So let the city of 1518 slowly disappear again. Let the stone streets become quiet. Let the distant voices fade. The musicians are gone. The crowds have gone home. The summer heat has finally broken. And the last movement has stopped. What remains is only the record, a handful of old accounts, and a question that has survived for more than 500 years. Why did they dance? We may never know completely. And perhaps, for a mystery this old, there is something peaceful in leaving a small part of it unanswered. Because history does not always give us a final door to open. Sometimes it gives us a window. We look through it for a while. We see another century, another city, another group of people trying to understand a world they could not fully control. And then the window closes. The street becomes dark. The story becomes quiet. And the night continues. Somewhere, another unresolved story is waiting, not necessarily louder, not necessarily stranger, just another small opening into the past, where the evidence ends before the questions do. Until then, you can simply rest, let the old city fade into the distance, and let the silence of Strasbourg carry the story away. Good night.